there, I'm going to show you the crushed stone inlay technique using sterling silver 1mm sheet fabrication method. It's actually quite easy. I'll show you how to do it. These are some of the supplies and materials that you'll be needing. You need your sheet metal. I'm using sterling silver 1mm for the top frame, and the back of the piece can be a thinner dimension, or 1mm is fine as well. You can also use copper or brass for this project. You will need your stone. Now for stone inlay, you want to use stones that are relatively soft, so nothing too extremely hard. Green malachite is a good stone. Lapis lazuli, you could use black marble, you can use coral, just to name a few. You'll need a method to crush the stone. I have sort of a mortar and pestle set up here, or you can use a simple metal hammer onto a hard surface. Just wear goggles while you're crushing. You will also need sandpapers. I have 180 to 1000. I have various rough tooth files. You can even wrap sandpaper around the file to help your sanding, or around a block of wood. And you also need a piece of paper, a sifting, some way to strain out and sift your broken crushed stone, and a paper towel on hand is good. You will also need a small tube of very liquid super glue. Don't use the gel kind. You could also use resin as another option. I prefer the super glue. It is an epoxy resin adhesive. And I also need glasses to have those on hand. I'm showing you a couple of the pieces that I have finished with the black marble. You can see how they're smooth, and it looks like one piece of metal rather than two layers. You essentially have a frame on the top piece where you want to fill in the stone, and then a back to hold everything in place. Here I have a piece that has been partially finished, and I'll go through the steps and the methods on how to do this. This piece has actually been cast from an original piece that I sawed and pierced the floor plan of a cathedral here, and then soldered it onto a back plate. Something like this. If you want, this is just an example. If I were to stone inlay this shape in here, I would want to cut out my top frame piece exactly how I want to see it. Then I would solder it onto a bigger backing piece, and you would be very careful on getting all of these seams completely well soldered. And then you could trim around your frame again with your saw. It would be rather impossible to try to saw out two shapes exactly the same like this and then solder them together. So I would recommend cutting out the first shape, soldering it onto the back plate, and then cutting around your shape as needed. Just to show you that I once made molds out of these pieces here, and then I can replicate the piece without having to resaw and pierce everything over again, which is quite handy if you're going to do multiples. Okay, in this unsoldered example of cutting out the frame, you want to make sure you have all the interior edges completely filed, because once you get them soldered onto the back, you won't be able to adjust that. And try to get the edges of the exterior of your frame also perfected, but you can file, and after you've done your sawing, after you've done your soldering, and then you can make sure that each edge is completely well soldered and that you have a nice seamless edge here. You would want to make sure you do all of your soldering before you begin to insert the stone. Obviously you wouldn't be able to heat the piece after you have added the stone and the epoxy glue. So before I had put the stone in, I made sure everything was completely soldered. You have to remember that if you're going to make a pendant, you have to solder on your backing, or if you're going to do a brooch, your pin back, etc. If you're doing earrings, stud earrings, you'd have to do all of the soldering before you begin doing the inlay. Now to prepare your piece, you don't need to do really any sanding or filing. You can do that after. And you in fact have to do a lot of filing on the top, so you definitely do not want to bother sanding that surface, because you're going to be roughing it up with your file and then sanding it at the end after you've inserted all the stone. So the first step is take your stone. This is a black marble. And I put it in my mortar and pestle, and I'm just literally crushing it. Or if you have a hammer, you can do the same. Grab something that you might have at home handy, maybe even a roll of tape here, just to hold it in as you're hammering. Then what you end up with are some crushed stone, and you want to put that in a little strainer or sieve and try to make separate piles of more powder and then a little bit of a bigger stone pieces. Okay, so I have my powder and I have my stone pieces. I can take my piece, and I've already begun this one. I've started inserting the stone, and you can see that I have a very small areas to fill in. So my stone I'm using is probably going to mostly be the small, more powdery sizes that I've crushed up here. If you have a larger area, for example, this area here to be filled in, I could get away with using some of the more bigger pieces, and then I could actually see the definition of the stone, so it would look more like a stone inlay or something that has been inset. The Italian term for that would be scagliola. And then you would see the actual stone rather than seeing just one smooth color of powder that could more likely resemble enamel rather than stone. So I've finished all of my soldering, and what I can do is take either a stylus or even my tweezers, and if I rough up the inside of the bottom of that area, it creates a little bit more of a tooth so that the stone will be adhering well to the surface. This is the fun part because you can scratch it on purpose. And then I can begin putting in small pieces of powder into those areas, just enough to cover the surface of the metal. And I can use my fingers or I can use tweezers, whichever you prefer. And take very small drops of super glue in there, and try not to put the tip of the glue directly onto the stone or it will stick. Try to let it drop through. Okay, now if your drop is a little bit too much, that's why you need to have a paper towel handy, because you really want to soak up that excess glue, especially the part that is on the surface, because it's very difficult to get off later. And you also don't want your spaces to fill in with too much glue, because otherwise there won't be room for the stone and it will just look transparent. Then you can go and start to put in some more stones that are a little bit bigger and fill in those areas. Remember, super glue has a little bit of an odor, so try not to hover too close over it and breathe. You might even want to wear a mask. Okay, and I'm trying to fill in this space little by little, but I'm trying also not to mound the stone too high, because the more you add, the more you'll have to file down later, and that takes a lot of effort. Then I can fill in any little gaps with more stone, or the powdery size. Again, I'm trying not to mound too much on there, but I do want to make sure all the areas are completely filled up to the surface level of the metal. And then I may even need to add another little droplet of glue. Then little by little, try to fill in all your spaces and let the glue dry as long as possible. If you can wait, a couple of hours is best, because even if it feels dry on top, it might be a little bit damp underneath. And then the stones will start to come out as you're filing. Okay, now once everything is dry, and this is definitely dry because I've worked on it a long time ago, I can move these out of the way. Then you're going to start the step of filing and sanding down the surface. So what I can start to do is literally start filing away at that stone. It's already going down quite a bit. Or, like I said, you can also wrap sandpaper around anything rigid, like another file or a wood block. And you'll have to do much more filing until it becomes to the level of the metal. And then you can see if you need to fill in little holes, which you most likely will because there's always some little gaps that didn't get filled in. And you can do that same method as before. You just add a little bit of glue and a little bit of powder and fill in those little holes and gaps. So this is going to be sanded completely flat once it's all finished. File it down to the surface, and then you begin with your sandpaper, starting with the 180. I would need to do much more filing than this, but you also need to go through any glue that has adhered to the surface, which in my case is quite a bit because it's spilled out. But you're going to be sanding, and the more you sand down to the level of the metal, your design will reappear. This looks like you can't see it at all because I need to do some more filing. So you may need to do this a few times if you need to fill in little holes and gaps until you get it completely filled in. And more sanding until you get to a point where your design is revealed because it's all one smooth surface. Okay, this piece is a finished one, of course, and it can be polished on the polishing wheel if you want a shiny polish, or it can be put in a metal magnetic tumbler, which this one is, so it has a little bit more of a matte surface. Now, sometimes when you put it in a tumbler, it does pull out a little bit of the stone, and I might even see some little teeny points that could be filled in. You might even want to use even like a safety pin or a thumbtack, something very tiny that you can get into that little crevice and stick some powder of the crushed stone and a little teeny bit of glue into those holes if you want to get it perfected. But that's what the finished piece would look like. Here's another one, and you can see you can get quite a bit of detail if you use very powder stone. But if you look closely, I can see some of the stone definition in there, and that I think is more ideal. So there you go. That is basic stone inlay. Here's a piece in progress. And a finished piece. And another. This one has a very small detail of the stone inlay. This is a mold of another piece where you can actually see the negative or the positive. This is the space that would be filled in with the stone once you have the positive of this mold.